I'm Allen Mendenhall, Executive Director of the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. And Daphne Posadas is with me today to talk about the recent elections, presidential elections in Guatemala. She is a graduate assistant and MA student in economics in the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy. And she earned her undergraduate degree from Universidad Francisco Marroquín in Guatemala and is a Guatemalan citizen. And I'm very happy to have this conversation with you this morning, Daphne.
Hi, Alan. It's such a pleasure to have this discussion with you. Guatemalan elections happened just recently between the months of June and August, and it has been a very weird electoral process for Guatemalans. So I think it's interesting and important to bring it to American audiences.
Well, we'll start by just generally informing people about the results of the election. What took place? Who was the victorious candidate?
Okay, yeah. These elections were very weird. Like I say, I think that would be like one of the characteristics or adjectives that I would say about these elections is that they were very atypical and were filled with uncertainty. Like it was a very uncertain process overall. The guy who won the elections, his name is Bernardo Arevalo. He is the son of a former president in Guatemala, Juan Jose Arevalo. He was president of Guatemala in the 50s, and he is the one who actually created the IX, which is our public, well, network of social security health systems around the country. So he was a very loved president, and one of the main issues that Bernardo Arevalo, his son, who won the elections, kind of brought to every discussion is how good his father was. So ultimately, he would be good. Bernardo Arevalo is an academic. He studied sociology somewhere in Europe. He is a very prepared man. He used to work in a lot of think tanks back in Guatemala. And he actually was a member of Congress in this past period from 2020 to 2024. Um, the guy, he was not very known in Guatemala. Actually, just a few months before the first round of elections, he was relatively unknown. He had only 2% of the votes intentions. And well, surprisingly, he made it to on the first round. He won the second round, and he is the guy who's becoming president. He won with about 2,400,000 votes, which is a lot of votes. It's about 60% of all the votes that were received that day. And his contender was Sandra Torres, who is the member of a political party called Unidad Nacional de la Esperanza, UNE. And this party, UNE, has been in power before. It's actually the only party that has been in power in the president's office with her husband, actually, or former husband, and remains a political party. The thing about parties in Guatemala is that they're very volatile, so they kind of show up for one election and disappear for the next election. And this political party is one of the strongest parties in Guatemala. And she only got 37% of the votes. She has been like she's known to be like an establishment political party, an establishment candidate. She's someone who would maintain the status quo, whereas Bernardo Arevalo seems to like he sold himself as someone who was not in favor of the status quo, and he would make changes to the status quo. So he offers a lot of change in the country. He offers a lot of transparency in his government, and he also offers, and this is one of the biggest issues, which to me are very on the margin of populism, but he offers like the reduction or the disappearance of corruption in the country, because corruption is a very big issue in Guatemala. So that's a little like very broad summary about what he represents, what he does, and how, like, what was his campaign in order to like win these elections.
Excellent. Thank you very much. How was this election different from other elections in Guatemala?
Many things. First, what I was mentioning at the beginning, right? Usually, whenever we do polls, and then we have this newspaper that's very important in Guatemala called Prensa Libre. Whenever we receive these polls from this newspaper, we know that they're most likely to be right. They're most likely to actually predict results, so they're gonna be very accurate. Um, what the Prensa Libre poll showed us on the first round of elections. So Guatemala, we do 2 rounds of elections. On the first round of elections, all the people who are participating for um, presidency, for Congress, for Parlamento Centroamericano, which is like our Senate, Central American Senate, people who are running for local offices, all of them, they run on that first day. So that first day, voters receive five different pieces of paper where we vote, right? And that's another thing that it's very different from the US. We vote with pen and paper still, which to me it's actually great because it protects us from a lot of things. um but yeah, that day we have many votes to cast. But then, like, especially when it comes to the presidency, um 23 political parties were running for the presidency on that first round of elections, right? And on that first round of elections, what the poll said is that we were either going to have Suri Rios, which is another status quo candidate. She, like Sandra Torres, is more lean to the left. She's a Marxist. Has actually been a member of the International Socialist. So she is definitely a very left-wing candidate. But then you had many right-wing candidates who could run to that second round of elections, who could be Suri Rios, who appeared very high on the polls. She is the daughter of a former dictator in Guatemala, um, General Rios Montt. We also have another right-wing candidate called Edmond Mulet. He actually used to work at the United Nations, and he worked as the head of security for Haiti, for the UN. So he's a very prepared man. And then we had a lot of like right wing candidates who might swing it, but these two were probably the ones who were gonna go to the second round with Sandra Torres. One important thing to mention is that, or you know what, I'm actually gonna mention it as a second difference. Anyways, so this is like this. The first poll showed us this. These are gonna be the two candidates that are gonna pass, and against Sandra Torres. But what we actually saw in the first election is that none of them were actually not even in the top three contenders. Like out of nowhere, literally out of nowhere, Bernardo Arevalo managed to filter himself and go through the second route. So that's definitely one of the big things in this Guatemalan elections, because as citizens, we usually use the polls to kind of like understand the political landscape in which we're voting. So that's one big difference. A second big difference is that the lack of institutions that are strong enough in Latin American countries, and that's the same case for Guatemala, often make political processes very difficult. However, the elections used to be something that were relatively transparent. They were relatively well guarded, and the Supreme Electoral Authority, which we call it Tribunal Supremo Electoral, these guys would have the ultimate decisions on what happened with the election process. However, in these elections, and this is something very, very different for us, there were a lot of rulings made by the Supreme Court of Justice or by the Constitutional Court saying that certain runners for the presidency couldn't run for the election. Such is the case, for example, for Carlos Pineda, who was a guy who he had no political experience. He's a guy who has a lot of land and owns a lot of land in one of the departments up north in Guatemala. But mostly his campaign, he ran it through TikTok. He had been growing his TikTok profile. And he was very, he seemed to be very close to the people. And all of a sudden, one of the polls that run very, very early, like around March, we have our elections in June, the first round. And one of the polls that ran in March placed him at the top. He had about 39% of election vote intentions of being elected by the people. And then all of a sudden, the Supreme Court rules that he cannot run because there seems to be some irregular things with his inscription. So he's eliminated. Then there's this other guy whose name is Roberto Arzu, who is also the son of another of another former president in Guatemala. He has participated in the past, but for some reason they didn't let him participate this round. And then, there's many cases that I could mention, but these two are very relevant because they seem to be very popular with people. So there were a lot of like interventions by other institutions, political institutions, that were like kind of making the process less transparent. And nobody said anything, nobody did anything, which leads us to the great difference to me is that usually, like I said, elections in Guatemala are very transparent. They follow the process, right? You have your elections, the supreme authority, electoral authority, confirms those results, and then you're good to go. We have certainty that these are the results. What has happened in this particular election is that we didn't have confirmation of the results in the first round of elections until 3 weeks later. And for this second round, we did receive a confirmation, but now the General Attorney's Office is kind of intervening in the process and says that there was fraud in the elections, so that they need to open the boxes where the ballots are safeguarded. They need to open and recount it, which has never happened before. So these are very like Guatemalan citizens feel very uncertain about what's going to be the future, especially because this from September to January, these are supposed to be months where the new presidency received, or the new president and his team receive all the information they need from the previous president, and they start doing the transition. Instead, they're trying to guarantee that they actually get to that day, so that they're able, to receive the presidency. So it's very crazy because there are many differences, and I would say, like at the beginning, I mentioned two things that I would say characterize this election process are uncertainty and weird, because I would summarize it like that, because it's been very weird, and especially for citizens. Like, if you're a citizen who is politically involved or politically informed, you might be able to follow track of all these things that are going on. But if you're a citizen and you assume your rational ignorance, you might not have the incentives to understand what's really going on. And you might not even understand it until it's too late. So effectively what they're trying to do, or what these political actors are trying to do, is just make sure that the guy who won is the guy who they wanted to win at the beginning, which is kind of weird. But those are some key differences that I would say for this election process than others.
I noticed that the U.S. Department of State issued a proclamation supporting the results of the election and stating that the United States considered the election to be fair and valid, and that it was supporting the results, and the Guatemalan people as understood by the U.S. Department of State. That's very interesting. So I spoke to a mutual friend of ours at UFM in Guatemala about the election before the results. This may have been end of July, early August. And she is, I think, fairly characterized as a free market libertarian. and wasn't sure which candidate to vote for. Now, somebody with that orientation would vote for which candidate, or would have voted for which candidate, in your opinion? Was that is that even an obvious choice for someone like that?
No, it's not. And that's actually one of the differences that I forgot to mention before. It's that all of the previous elections, you would have a left-wing candidate and a right-wing candidate. So you kind of knew, like, if you were more aligned with the right or with the left, you would kind of know which candidate to vote for. These elections, we had two left-wing candidates. So Sandra Torres, like I said, she is more of a Marxist. Like, she was a member of the International Socialist, and she has a lot of populist proposals, such as, like, this literally happened like 2 weeks before the elections in Guatemala. I know you've been, Alan, but I don't know if you noticed that there are a lot of motorcycles, but not like Harley Davidson type, but just motorcycles, like
The
Chinese
scooters.
Indian motorcycles. Yeah, but like very tiny motorcycles. And the reason is because it's very difficult for Guatemalans to move. It's not safe enough to walk. You have to move very great distances. So people usually buy motorcycles. It's actually the vehicle that's most bought in Guatemala. And so one of the things that this candidate was proposing like 2 weeks before the second round was, I'm going to give an extra bonus of, I think it was around $50 to each motorcycle, which didn't even make sense. It's very populist. But she has a lot of this social welfare programs. And then for this election, she wanted to, like, say that she was a right-wing candidate, which, if you have followed her in the previous years, she started contending 2 elections ago, 3 elections ago, and she's always been your typical left-wing populist type of candidate. Although she has a very bad temper, so she doesn't connect with people because she tends to be very rude. And then on the other side, you had Bernardo Arevalo, um, from the political party Movimiento Semilla. And these guys, I would say, are more like moderate left, but they literally say their economic policies are Keynesian type of policies. Um, and actually, they have one of the guys who seems to be, probably going to be appointed as the Ministry of Finance, who literally says, we need to increase deficit in the budget for Guatemala because we don't have enough money to support all the welfare programs that we want to run. So I would say, if you're more of a libertarian, definitely not, like, either of the candidates are good for you. And this is something that was very different. I would say, like, if you're very moral to your convictions, you would vote for neither of them. You would vote new, yeah, because I mean, no, none of them will bring proposals to the table. One thing that I believe might be or could have been a distinction between them is, like, how these candidates have behaved in the past, especially when it comes to political power, like how they have used that political power that they have gained. So, for example, Sandra Torres, her husband was the president of Guatemala from 2008 to 2012, and they were filled with corruption scandals. Actually, Sandra Torres was in prison right before these elections. There are some very funny pictures of her, like, with handcuffs. But she was actually in prison and for embezzlement and for corruption scandals, which were not scandals, right? There was proof of her being involved in those cases. And then Bernardo Arevalo, these people, I wouldn't say they're not corrupt because, once you're in politics, I believe there's a chance that you might be a little corrupt, at least. You know how they say, or how Lord Acton tends to say, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power tends to corrupt. Absolutely. But I mean, these guys seem to be a little bit more transparent and a little bit more committed to that non-corruption type, which I don't even know if it's a good idea, but that's why, to me, these elections were very different. And I think, like, people would one of the main reasons why people voted for Bernardo Arevalo is not necessarily because they have convictions on Keynesian ideas or they have conviction on left-wing ideas. It's just because they're, sick of the status quo, and they didn't want to vote for Sandra Torres because they knew she represented the status quo. So they just wanted something different, and different doesn't mean good, right? So we'll see how it goes.
Well, thank you, Daphne, for bringing our audience up to speed and for updating us on the status of the presidential election in Guatemala.
You're welcome.